let's stay with France for a minute. You go into France. France, the beaches of Normandy have had special meaning for your family, which you go into the book. And I think would you like to share a passage?
I'd love to, but I'd love to explain to everybody. I've been a student of war for a long time because of my early introduction to the war. I write in the book about how my first memory as a child is holding my mother's hand, walking through the ruins of the house that had been burned, and she took me back there in 1947. I'm 4 years old. And my two memories are, one, holding her hand, hearing the glass, broken glass, crunching beneath our feet in grass that had grown up sort of knee-high, and walking through the rubble and just seeing a staircase going up into the sky and a chimney going up into the sky. And this was my first introduction to it all. And I didn't know why my mother was crying. It bothered me, obviously, as a kid, why my mother was upset. But that was indelible, that impression of broken house, bombed house, mother upset, tears, destruction. And outside the house was a huge German bunker, which was a bunker looking over the water near where the house was. And so my grandfather rebuilt the house after the war. And I've had 31 first cousins, I have 29 first cousins. All of us, to this day, still care for that house. We all share the cost of running it and keep it going. And it's become a great place for the family historically. But I would go back many times in my youth because of my being in Switzerland, being in Europe, following my father to our posts. And the result was, it was like having 29 brothers and sisters. We all grew up together over a long period of time. And I played in German bunkers. I went to various places where the bunkers were an exciting sightseeing tour, and we go through them. But the beaches of Normandy, my dad took me back to them as a little older. I remember seeing detritus of war on the beaches of Normandy, burnt out Higgins boats, tanks, and things. They still hadn't cleared them. And so for me, always, it's been a sacred, unbelievable place. But as I grew up and I read all the books, The Longest Day, you name it, Ambrose, everybody on the war, and Churchill and Eisenhower, I think a lot about it. And then as a combatant who went to war, very different kind of war, I thought about the differences in how we were shot at versus that moment. We were always ambushed. We were driving these 50-foot aluminum boats with twin diesel engines up the rivers, and we were just sort of holding our breath and waiting for the Viet Cong to shoot at us from the mangroves and the bunkers that they would build. And we were constantly being shot at in that way, and we'd shoot back and kind of clear the fire zone to get out of the line of fire. But we weren't gaining much. I mean, this is part of what bothered me and began to turn me against the war. I didn't think it was particularly strategic, particularly smart. And one of the awards that I got later on was because I was the officer in tactical command of 3 boats going up a river, tiny little river, not big. And we were ambushed. But I had learned by then to distinguish small arms fire from heavy caliber. You knew a 50 caliber, and you knew an M60 and machine gun, and you knew the clack, clack, clack of an AK-47 or a carbine, Chinese Chi-Com, we call them carbine. You could tell it very well. So I knew immediately that there was no heavy caliber. And we talked about this with the other officers of the 2 other boats. And I said, rather than just going by broadside, if it's not, depending on the size of the ambush, maybe we just turn towards them. And there's a lower profile, and we put our heavy guns on them. So I tried it. I just ordered all 3 boats, turn, 090, turn immediately. And by God, they did it. And we went 20 yards forward, beached right in the ambush, and we completely overran the ambush. We had troops on the back of our boat, too. We unloaded the troops and went after these guys on the shore. So this became a new sort of way that people started to think about how we could deal with it. But to me, this is the point that comes back to Normandy. It's a whole different world. You know, I write about this in the book. Ernest Hemingway talked about how to be a good soldier. You have to suspend the imagination. If your imagination is so intense that you're imagining all the terrible things that are going to happen to you, you may not be a great soldier. But if you can suspend the imagination, you can be a much better soldier. And I thought about that because we never knew when we were going to be shot at precisely. We could guess pretty much. You get in the river, you go a certain distance, but you didn't know. And we knew they were hiding in mud bunkers, and there were only X number of them, right? These guys at Normandy, folks, and I write about this because I find it the most awesome, extraordinary gift to our country, to the world, to the fight against fascism, to the fight for democracy. It's why we should care about veterans as much as I hope, and I think the country does more now than it did when we first came back. But now that ethic's, you know, very high. It wasn't all the period of time. But the point I make is that in those Higgins boats, on that gray day off the coast of France, when those guys were lowered down to the boats and bobbing around for hours while everybody got loaded until they started into the beach, and then they start into the beach and guys are being seasick and they're cold and they're wet and they're driving towards this incredible beach, and there's a huge bluff up above it filled with these concrete fortresses with artillery and machine guns, and you know, you can't penetrate it. And you know, because you see a boat get blown up 20 yards off to your right and 30 yards to your left, and the whole boat goes up in the air and everybody in it is killed, and you're still going forward towards that beach. And then the door drops, and half the people in that boat, or all of them, are dead within seconds. You know, and you forge ahead, trying to get up that beach, and you're pinned down on the beach. And those of you who saw Saving Private Ryan, you get a little sense of that. It's to me, you know, they're just extraordinary. That was the most awesome display of courage and determination on behalf of our nation and the nations we were fighting with to beat back evil. Now, I don't take anything away from guys who've gone to Iraq, Iran. War is war, and it's horrible. It's terrible, no matter where it is. And those guys are heroic. And every single one of them deserves what they did. But there is a qualitative difference between a tiny boat and a door dropping and a fortress in front of you and the knowledge that in a few minutes you're going to be dead. Not maybe blown up by an IED or whatever, but you're going to be dead. And you still do it. That's a gift, folks. So I wrote, because they deserve it. But I hope I can get through this piece, because Teresa and I went back. Teresa, my wife, we were not yet married, but we had gone to France. We were seeing each other. And I wanted her to share my sense of reverence for the history of this place. And so we went there, and here is what I wrote. Because it was September, there weren't that many people. The setting is always breathtaking. And when you are walking almost by yourselves amid the crosses and stars of David, noting the dates of death and the names engraved on the headstones, the emotional and historical sweep of the place overwhelms you. We went all the way down to a near deserted part of the beach where troops had broken through on D-Day. There we sat on some rocks at the edge of the beach. The tide was rising, and we measured each wave as it reached closer and closer to the rocks. The entire time we were there, mesmerized by the stillness and the beauty, an older gentleman, and we presumed his wife, were sitting together in an embrace, looking out at the water, not moving, lost in thought. I am certain he was a returned veteran, someone who survived that extraordinary landing, someone who had come back to find peace and perhaps remember the friends he had lost at that very place. Quietly but deliberately, he stood up. He took off all his clothes, piece by piece. Then, completely naked, with a squeeze of his wife's hand, He walked straight out into the water, unabashed, unembarrassed, without awareness of anybody watching, lost in his memories in the moment. He seemed to be performing a ritual purification, allowing the waves to carry him in and out as they had once washed soldiers' bodies back and forth until the dead were finally recovered after the fighting on the beach. Teresa and I, holding hands, watched in silence. We were frozen in that spot on the beach as if for an eternity. To this day, it is one of the most touching, beautiful moments we have ever witnessed together. It was mystical and a gift. That's what I think that place means, and I think it's something people in our country need to sort of stop and find a way to grab onto and get a hold of as we think about what's happening in Washington. I don't mean to bring it back, but folks, you think of the bigness of that. Think of the extraordinary nature of people putting themselves on the line like that, and then you see the squabbling and the pettiness and the distance from the American people that place is. I wish there was a way to break through on that, but we've got to bring our country back together. We've got to find a way to do our nation's business, and that's how we're going to make our country stronger and better. The only way I know.
Thank you for that. I want to touch on how you got yourself back together after your war experience. You were troubled by faith, and you say in the Senate prayer breakfast, those experiences with the other senators helped you reconcile your own sense of faith after experience all these injustices and horrors of war.
Well, I think you're being very polite, Randall. I think that, I had a crisis of faith that I think most people, many people in war do, loads of people in life do. I know my dad did because of his sister's polio, his father's suicide, and his sister's death not too many years later. It's very hard for people who have been the victims of war, the victims of a terrible event, to rationalize or properly put in place the concept of an omnipotent, omnipresent God who has a plan for you. It's very hard, it was hard for me to reconcile what's God's plan when Dick Pershing, my good buddy at Yale, got killed in Tet and didn't get to come home and marry his fiancée. What kind of plan is that? Or what's the plan for My Lai? And it's very hard. It's also hard, and this is not new. My journey is, billions of people have been through this journey over time, and everybody lands somewhere. You can go back in history, and I try to go back a little bit. I'm fascinated by comparative religion. If you read the scriptures of the three Abrahamic faiths, you have Judaism and Islam and Christianity, each of which have amazing similar passages at some point, similar allegories, similar stories. And the reason for that is that all of it is passed on through oral presentation and ultimately found its way into writing. But there are shared components of it. Jews lived right next to Muslims in parts of the Middle East, not in Jerusalem I'm talking about, but in different places in the Middle East, not far from Medina and Mecca, where Muhammad was preaching. And people took different things from each other. We have to think about that as we think about religious extremism and the exploitation that engages and so forth. But coming back to faith, I just had a time where it was very difficult to reconcile suffering and natural disasters. The Hawaii volcano, the fires. Those can't be explained away as being evil, which is where a lot of explanation put things for bad. Evil. There's a fight between good and evil things are evil. And yeah, certain things that happen to you and certain behavior and certain things are explainable as evil. But a natural disaster is not. And if you go back to the Lisbon earthquake, 1600s, and Voltaire and Rousseau were fighting over this notion, great debate about how you reconcile this issue about a merciful God and all forgiving and so forth. So you all can go through your own sort of journeys and struggles on this, but I write a bit about it because in the Senate, we have a prayer breakfast. We meet every Wednesday. Republicans and Democrats were invited. There were more Republicans there than Democrats. Various reasons for that. I found that after a while, I gained enough confidence in my own sort of journey because I spent a lot of time reading. You know, I read Reinhold Niebuhr, I'd read Hegel, Kant, philosophy, I'd read the papal encyclicals, Salvifici Doloris, by Pope John Paul II, who wrote about having been shot 4 times. How do you explain that one? The Pope. But he wrote this brilliant treatise on sort of how you deal with suffering in the context of it opening up the possibility of understanding God or Jesus in your life. And so I was fascinated by that, and I talked about it in this prayer breakfast. And afterwards, Senator Ted Stevens, Republican, who lost his wife in an airplane accident. He was cradling her in his arms, and she died. He couldn't reconcile, he couldn't understand it. But at the end of my going through the writings and some of the explanations of it and my own struggle, he came up to me afterwards, he said, I wish I'd known you years ago because you changed my life today. And he began to be able to put it in a better place. And that's a very private component of the United States Senate that most people never hear about, you never know of. Sadly, I began to have some trouble reconciling the way people voted with the things they were saying in the room. And that kind of became a different tug of war, if you don't mind my saying so. Because I think that for me as a Christian, Matthew 25, the Sermon on the Mount, the proposition that you visit the people in prison and you feed the hungry and you clothe the naked and so forth, to me, that's what I learned way back when. And there ain't enough of that, folks. And I think we have to have less dogma thrown at us and a little more individual appreciation for what it all kind of really means. And I write about all of this in the book.